Death is something all humans need to grapple with. All of us will eventually have to face our inevitable mortality. Because humans love pondering about this so much, it should come as a shock to no one that the topic of death is a huge one in philosophy. And of course, Chinese philosophy is no exception. From Confucianism, also known as Ruism, to Buddhism, different Chinese philosophies have had different interpretations on this subject throughout China's long history. In this video, I'd like to explore two things. The first is how different schools of Chinese thought, including Ruism, Mohism, Daoism, and Buddhism, viewed death. The second is how we can observe the adaptability of Chinese philosophy, especially Ruism, through the lens of death and how this adaptability can be extended to modern-day China and East Asia in general. Initially, the concept of death as a philosophical construct was not emphasized very heavily in classical Ruism during the Zhou dynasty. Ruists were more concerned with the spiritual immortality that came with the cultivation of virtue. Kongzi says in the Analects that Duke Jing of Qi had 1,000 teams of horses, and yet the day he died, the people found no virtue in him to praise. Bo Yi and Shu Qi starved to death at the foot of Mount Shouyang, yet down to the present day, people sing their praises, showing that those who not only closely follow the way, but also sacrifice themselves in pursuit of the way when necessary, to be the ultimate embodiment of virtue. In Kongzi's view, a life without the way is not one worth living, a sentiment shared by his successor Mengzi, who said that life is something I desire. Righteousness is also something I desire. If I cannot have both, I will forsake life and select righteousness. Living a good life essentially boils down to adhering to principles and values one will live by and die by. Indeed, the larger concern with death was how one reacts in response to such a monumental event, and how it should be handled within the context of living a noble life of the Junzi. The Ruist perspective on death was something more akin to death is a natural part of life and doesn't need explanation. They weren't really interested in the origins or essence of death, nor what happens after. Instead, Ruists should be focused on their lives while they're, alive. Kongzi says in response to his disciple Zilu's inquiry on death that, "You do not yet understand life. How could you possibly understand death?" implying that one should be focused on cultivating the self of the present, rather than worrying about unworldly, abstract ideas like death, ghosts, and spirits. It's like Holmes is asking, you can't even understand your present situation, so why should you worry about what's to come after? However, this does not mean that Kongzi viewed death as an obsolete event. On the contrary, Kongzi and Ruist place heavy emphasis on rites and rituals mourning the dead, viewing death as a tragic event that needed prolonged periods of mourning. There are several instances in the Analects where Kongzi can be observed mourning his disciples who have contracted illnesses or died. His disciples Bo Niu and Yin Hui are such examples. We know from the Analects that when Yin Hui passed away, the master lamented, "Oh, heaven has bereft me! Heaven has bereft me!" Furthermore, Kongzi is the one who promoted extremely elaborate funeral rites, of which Mozi would very much look down upon. Kongzi says that it is better to be excessively sorrowful than fastidious when mourning, and that a son should mourn his parents' death for 3 years before moving on, in order to be called filial. Clearly, Kongzi did not take death lightly. The fact that death is a natural part of life does not make it any less tragic. I will now take some time to explain a little about Mohism, a rivaling philosophy of Ruism from around the same time, just to provide some context for the next Ruist scholar, Xunzi. Mohism primarily rose in prominence in response to the failures of Ruism during the 5th century in the Zhou dynasty. During this time, Mozi observed failures in society he attributed to Kongzi's excessive teachings and rituals, and as a result, took a much more pragmatic and utilitarian approach to mourning. One of Mozi's biggest criticisms of Ruism was how unnecessarily lavish it was when it came to funeral rites. Extravagant mourning only served to waste a country's precious resources. Furthermore, extended periods of mourning only served to weaken a nation because it prevented people from being productive members of society, and as such, entailed bearing a great deal of wealth. Mozi also uses a Ruist antiquity argument, stating that the sage kings Yao and Shu of the past were buried plainly and humbly, implying that if the Ruists were so adamant about following antiquity, then they should be performing modest funerals instead of extravagant ones. Another thing is that Mozi really emphasized respecting ghosts and spirits. However, this low-key contradicts with his claim that ritual is not necessary, because how would ghosts and spirits be happy if we were just stomping over their graves? Frankly, it kinda seems like Mozi is just being a contrarian for the sake of hating Ruism, which is valid because he was living in a time much more chaotic than Kongzi, but it also shows a lack of development in his ideas. Mozi is probably Buddhism's only known leader, and is a prime example of how philosophies could develop in response to others' failures. Indeed, Rui's scholars would further develop their ideas of death and the ritual in response to Mozi's criticisms. Xunzi is our last classical Confucian scholar, and he devoted much of his effort into defending Ruism from various challenges, including the aforementioned Mozi. Xunzi valued ritual, claiming it was a means of emotional regulation and release. Especially in affairs that concern death, ritual takes care that fortunate and unfortunate events do not intrude upon each other. In other words, Xunzi viewed funerary rites as a way for people to gain closure, to work through their emotions of sadness, so that they could smoothly move on with their lives. In fact, this idea thoroughly extends to Xunzi's belief on ritual in general. He views it as a way of emotional programming, whether it be lifting people's spirits before a harvest or mourning their dearest loved ones. Ritual can harness people's emotions in a way that will not affect their daily lives. This is in contrast to Mozi, who viewed rites merely as a waste of not only time, but also state's resources. It is worth noting that Xunzi did not go as hard on the funeral propriety as Kongzi, decreasing mourning time and dressing the corpse more modestly and stuff like that, illustrating that Mozi may have been right in a way, Kongzi may have been doing too much. But it is also worth considering that Xunzi used ritual as a way to bring together coarser material and finer ornaments, weeping and music, happiness and sorrow, making use of contradicting elements to really find the meaning of the ritual by paying homage to both good and ill fortune. Indeed, viewing ritual as the midway course of things makes it the perfect guide to human emotions, as it can express both the positive and negative emotions in different ways, whether it be through one's voice, food and drink, dress, etc. Another key point Xunzi makes in regards to funerary rites is the fact that the ability for humans to mourn the passing of other people is what makes us human. Xunzi says that if one day a person loses his lord or father, but his manner in sending them off to be buried is neither sad nor respectful, then he is close to being a beast, implying that Mozi's anti-ritual views are barbaric. Just like birth, death is also a part of the human cycle and needs to be regarded with reverence. Ritual orders these two things, and therefore should be practiced appropriately. To treat people generously while alive, but stingily when dead, is to show respect to those with awareness and show arrogance to those without awareness. Indeed, Xunzi's arguments on the practice of funerary rites illustrate a development in Ruism's philosophy, particularly in the purpose of ritual. It has evolved from something that is practiced as a form of respect to the deceased, further into a necessary means of emotional regulation. Xunzi specifically argues that contrary to Mozi's claims that ritual would make a nation less productive and lead to its ruin, ritual actually leads to increased productivity because it would boost morale of the civilians. Because they are able to process their emotions, they would not let grief get in the way of their responsibilities. We begin to see how adaptable Ruism is, as there are scholars like Xunzi responding to the criticism of the philosophy not only by refuting those ideas, but also interjecting their own takes to further push the ideas along. This overarching theme of Ruis adaptability is something that can be observed all throughout China's history, making Ruism one of the most widespread thoughts in East Asia because of how relevant it was able to stay. Salam alaikum, alaikum salam. Unlike Ruism, Daoism takes a much more abstract deep dive into the concepts of death. Daoists advocated the idea that death represented a return to the Tao, or back to the nothingness that we all came from. The Tao is a way of change and manifests constant transformations, perhaps beyond human comprehension. Zhuangzi argues that in death no strange new fate befalls us. In the beginning, we lack not life only, but form, not form only, but spirit. We are blended in the one great featureless, indistinguishable mass. Originally, we are all part of the Tao, and by some chance we are transformed and given form, on earth, as unique crystallizations of the Tao. Of course, all things must come to an end, including our time on the earth, and thus we return back to the Tao, back to where we came from. It is just the natural order of things. Unlike Confucian scholars who emphasized grief as the proper and natural response to death, Zhuangzi has a profoundly different view. He insists that people who experience these negative emotions are still burdened by their feelings and will never be free or attain comprehension of the Tao. In fact, this is clearly seen when he ceases mourning his wife after she has died, because that would be knowing, quote, nothing of nature and sovereign law, indeed implying that going along with the changes of life, even if they may be tragic, is the only way that one can free the mind from any emotional damage or harm. With this, Zhuangzi instills a skepticism about death in us. It is impossible to know what will happen after death. He offers up some ideas like how the great clod burdens me with form, toils me through life, eases me in old age, and rests me in death, and among the dead, none is king and none is subject, and there may be an even greater awakening after which you know that this too was just a greater dream, meaning that 1. Death offers a release to life's myriad of problems, 2. All are equal in death, and 3. Perhaps the lives we are living right now are dreams which we will awaken from through death. Indeed, it is impossible to know what will happen after death, so what is the point in pondering something like that? The keystone of Zhuangzi's skepticism lies in its thought-provoking possibilities, which ultimately exposes our ignorance and eases our anxieties. Why worry about something you will never understand until you experience it? Zhuangzi is not praising death. He is reframing it in a way that we shouldn't be afraid of, because it is just part of the motions of life. As Mark Bergson eloquently puts it, Zhuangzi's sages do not fling themselves at death, rather they accept life and death equally, each as it comes. To see these Taoist practices in action, we turn to Emperor Wen of Zhou, who wrote in his testamentary edict that there is none which does not have its time of death, for death is a part of the abiding order of heaven and earth, and the natural end of all creatures, mirroring Zhuangzi's sentiment on viewing death as the natural course of life. Indeed, Emperor Wen displays a profound sense of enlightenment in writing this edict. Because he has shown he has made peace with his death, he has also shown mastery of the Taoist ideal of transformations and equanimity. Let's step away from all this philosophical mumbo-jumbo on how to face our inevitable mortality for a second, and talk about a core idea to Taoism, that of Wu-wei, which is the complete opposite of what Ruists were preaching. While Wu-wei literally translates to non-action, this idea is more along the lines of doing things with less interference than doing nothing at all. This Taoist virtue is also reflected heavily in their ideal of life and death. Taoist master Lao Tzu says that between life and death, 3 out of 10 are disciples of life, 3 out of 10 are disciples of death, 3 out of 10 create a place for death. Why is this? Because of their profound desire to live. Essentially, what this boils down to is that people who engage in action invite premature deaths because they create a place for death to enter. This is akin to the idea that the more you want something, the harder it is to get. Some people are fated to live long lives or die young, but about 1 in 3 bring misfortune to themselves. Basically, they be doing too much. The observant viewer will notice that this quote only talks about 9 out of 10 people. The missing person is of course the sage. By not doing, sages avoid creating a place for death to enter and therefore live long lives. Taoists believe in practicing Wu-wei to live out one's natural heaven-allotted lifespan, which is a bit bizarre considering that many Taoists did try to achieve immortality through some interesting means, which is the complete opposite of what Lao Tzu was preaching here. Frankly, the Taoist interpretation of death contrasts a lot with the Ruist interpretation, especially that of Xunzi's, who argued that mourning the dead was the right way to regulate emotions. While Ruists need structural ritual, true Taoists practice Wu-wei and operate outside of the social norm, beyond any sort of guideline. They don't need to do ritual, because doing won't help them return to the primal, natural state of the way. Of course, Taoism also heavily emphasized one's own relationship with death as a means of transformation. Basically, at this point, Taoism had given a lot more thought into the philosophy of death than Ruism had. However, this would all change with the introduction of Buddhism. Before we move on to our discussion on Buddhism and its impact on Ruism, I would like to bring up an interesting interpretation of death that was perhaps quite a bit ahead of its time. Despite being a Ruist in the Zhou dynasty, Wang Cheng had a much more empirical, and in a way Taoist view of death, boldly claiming that spirits were not real and that before a man is born, he has no consciousness. He exists in the midst of primal force, and after he dies, he returns again to this primal force. This is a very Taoist teaching, reminiscent of Zhuangzi's take on the pre-birth, post-death nothingness. Indeed, despite the fact that Wang Chun's discussion on death mainly focuses on refuting the idea that ghosts and spirits are not real, a very modern idea in and of itself, we can also see preemptive signs of Ru scholars pondering what happens after death way before Buddhism made its way into China. And this is likely because of Taoist influence. Daoism had started infiltrating Confucian thinking, and we once again see Ruism's ability to take on new ideas and adapt as necessary. Buddhism was introduced into China from India in the late Han Dynasty. It is worth noting that Ruism was the dominant philosophy during this time, but Buddhism still made its way into Chinese thought. This happened for a few reasons. Mainly, Buddhism gained popularity in China because the thinking of the time was lacking, especially in the spiritual aspect. Buddhism, unlike its Chinese counterparts of the time, provided thorough explanations to almost all inexplicable occurrences of daily life. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why do good things happen to bad people? If the Taoists are right, for example, and the way generates all fortunes and misfortunes, what good is practicing self-cultivation if one cannot increase goodness? Zhong Mi finds the teachings of Ruism and Daoism frustratingly lacking, and writes in On Humanity that the notion of heaven and the fundamental qi deciding the fates of people is a contradictory argument, asking why heaven, in assigning fates, gives so many poverty and so few wealth, so many loneliness, and so few prestige. He argues that if this is the case, then heaven's allotments are extremely unfair. Instead, Buddhists argue that people have something called the storehouse consciousness, which is a storage that contains all previous experience, including karma. Buddhists then use this idea of karma as a means to rationalize perplexing events because these are all determined by the detailed karmic consequences of actions in previous lives. This made Buddhism extremely appealing, as people could take solace in the fact that people who were bad would get what they deserved in a future life when they would have to burn off all their karma. Think something along the lines of, wow, I really hate you right now because of all the horrible things you do, but I won't feel too resentful because I know you will suffer in your next life. Buddhists also introduced the idea of elaborate hells, also known as the Naraka. The whole idea is that people would be born into a Naraka as a result of bad karma and would remain there for an indefinite amount of time until all the bad karma was used up. And the Buddhists got really creative with it. Utpala, the being's skin turns blue and splits open like the 4 petals of an Utpala flower. Mahararava, punishments for beings who maintain their body by hurting others. Animals torment them and eat their flesh. Mahapadma, the being's body cracks into pieces like a large lotus. Worms burrow in and consume the being. Kala Sutra, black lines are drawn on the being's bodies, which are used as guides to cut them apart, join them back together, and cut them apart again and again. That's some stuff no one wants to experience. In fact, Buddhists offer an alternate way to view death that has not really been seen before in China. They view the cycle of life, death, and rebirth, or samsara, as a cycle that needs to be escaped, that of which can be done through enlightenment, which can be achieved in different ways depending on the Buddhist school of thought you're considering. From the Buddhist perspective, death is a means to enlightenment, an opportunity to escape the cycle of samsara and finally reach nirvana. This is because the ultimate self exists beyond being bound to the physical form of a human body, which only brings suffering because a body has desires. Indeed, as Zhao Hong summarized, people practice Buddhism because of their fear of death. When they finally attain the wisdom of Buddhism, they understand that the authentic self is ultimately beyond death. With our previous discussion on Buddhism in mind, one can observe that Buddhism's perpetuation into Chinese thought really starts impacting Ruism. More specifically, it puts the idea of really conceptualizing death as a philosophical hurdle, rather than an unavoidable natural phenomenon on the radar of Ming Dynasty Ruists. In fact, before the Ming Dynasty, as we have discussed previously in this video, Ruism was a rather lackluster in its discussions on death because death was viewed as an ordinary occurrence. It focused on how one should react to the circumstances of death rather than one's own relationship with death. However, this opinion began to change during the Ming Dynasty. Rus began to grapple with the reality that a desire to live and a fear of death were natural. Not thinking about the terrible reality of one's own mortality became hypocritical because life and death are real psychological realities people need to face. It would be irresponsible to dismiss them as selfish concerns, as many Confucians during the Song dynasty did. As Wang Ji eloquently put it, if one cannot explore and come to understand the fundamental causes of life and death, then even brilliant work, outstanding talent, and the most successful career will in an instant turn into empty trappings when death comes upon one. In the end, all those things eventually have nothing to do with the life. Of what benefit will they be? Because life and death are such intrinsic parts of the human experience, they should be addressed. In this sense, Ruism really learned from Buddhism's and Daoism's discussions on death as a central part of their philosophy. Neo-Confucians used this fear of death to enrich their practices. By recognizing the universal fear of death every human has to experience, Yang Qiyuan argues that it is essential in pursuing the way of the sage. Yang says that every opportunity the sage has for saving the world arises by taking into account people's fear of death. In fact, facing this fear came to be regarded as a crucial part in the spiritual cultivation experience. Guo Xiangpeng writes that whether or not a person could peacefully face the threat of death became a criterion for reaching the level of sage. This is the idea that the sage can face death with a sense of serenity because they are able to go through daily life peacefully. If one is able to handle the coming of death peacefully, then they must have cultivated themselves to the level of a sage. By the same token, since life and death are two sides of the same coin, gaining understanding of one means you have also grasped the meaning of the other. Wang Ji says, "We experience gain and loss, good and bad, praise and blame, benefit and harm. If our mind-heart is slightly moved by any one of these, we will also be moved when death comes. Death is to life as night is to day. If we understand the day, then we understand the night." Indeed, taking the acceptance of death with tranquility as a criterion for achievement and enlightenment is a very Buddhist idea. The influences of Buddhism on Ruism are not limited to provoking the idea of death. They even extend to how Neo-Confucians handle death and decide to include it within their cultivation. Following how Ruism's view of death develops from when it first began in the Zhou dynasty all the way to the Neo-Confucianism in the Ming dynasty really makes clear how adaptable Chinese philosophy is. Chinese philosophies were prone to adaptation and reappropriation, not annihilation. As we have seen, Ruism goes from mostly ritual-focused practices on death to having a more philosophical interpretation on human mortality through influences like Daoism and Buddhism. And it's not just Ruism that adapted. Remember our plethora of Buddhist hells from earlier? Well, this just in, turns out with the assistance of Buddhas, you can pray your parents out of hell, which brings a whole new meaning to filial piety. In the story, Mu Lian rescues his mother. Mu Lian seeks the help of the Buddha to save his mother, who is burdened with bad karma from hell. This story shows that, from the Buddhist perspective, filial piety means taking of your parents not just in your current life, but also in future lives. By bringing the Confucian value of filial piety into Buddhism, Chinese Buddhists were able to ensure that Buddhism smoothly integrated into Chinese culture, displaying the syncretic nature of Chinese philosophies. If Buddhism did have filial aspects in it before, then integrating into Chinese thought is what really brought it out. Frankly, this adaptation is not limited to just death. We can see changes happening in all aspects of the Chinese philosophies. Death is merely one example. It is because of the willingness of Chinese scholars to adapt their ideas to be culturally more relevant, especially in Ruism, that the Chinese philosophical scene is as rich as it is today. To this day, Confucianism is one of the dominating philosophies, permeating throughout all of East Asia, from school systems to familial life. Furthermore, we can see this sort of adaptability in present-day China and East Asia, more specifically in the blend of Eastern and Western cultures. We see westernization, like in Japan's Meiji Restoration, but also a maintaining of past traditions within East Asian culture through festivals, education, and filial piety. As present bleeds into past traditions, one can't help but wonder if these ancient Chinese philosophies will hold up against the test of time, and how they will change in the future yet again.